The final boss of One Piece is here. His patience is limited, his powers are maximum, his pants are missing, but no one wants to be the one to tell him that for obvious reasons. And with a literal devil plus a wacky rubber hose cartoon protagonist, One Piece is now officially gunning to do its best impression of the final boss fight of Cuphead. So it's been speculated that Imu is a literal devil ever since we saw his arrow tail pierce Nefertari Cobra. It just looks like one of those classic cartoon devil tales, and the design of our Gunko being possessed by not our Imu is following that in all of the expected ways with the wings and the trident. And I'm a little bit conflicted about this form at the moment. I say at the moment because all of these things need time to settle in. For example, I was also not 100% on board with Gunko's design at first. I found the whole school uniform aesthetic a little bit bland for One Piece, but I have really grown to like it, especially after seeing her use her abilities. And I'm hoping it's the same for Imu here, because I'm not gonna lie, this whole devil thing, it is a little bit basic aesthetically. It currently lacks that Oda-specific flair of uniqueness. And seeing Imu in this chapter felt a lot like reading Black Clover. That's just what happens to my mind when you combine devils, spell circles, and grimoires. Although to Black Clover's credit, that series actually has some incredibly cool and unique devil designs that aren't quite as stereotypically cartoonish as Imu here. Now what I'm really hoping for is that this cartoonishness devil, it has a purpose, and that this power is something intended to rival Luffy's own cartoon abilities. Because the one thing that did really strike me, as well as struck the arm of Broggy, was Imu opening the grimoire, and of all of the things to pull out of it, he grabs a shotgun. And not just any shotgun either, but like this comically oversized shotgun. And I get that it has to be a certain size to deal substantive damage to a giant, but Imu shooting off Broggy's forearm should not have looked that adorable. And it gave me some really Sinister Gear Fifth vibes. As Luffy can pull any object out of any place he wants, that is his privilege as the wielder of the powers of a rather imaginative sun god. And right here, Imu is looking like he has that same infinite well of power to pull from, but situated on the other side of the light and dark spectrum. So Wano introduced us to the power of light through Gear Fifth, the warm embrace as well as the scorching heat of the imagination of the sun. And this chapter gives us a horrifying look into the chilled depths of the abyss, such as the namesake of this chapter, which is a very cool ability named Domi Reversi, which is Latin for I returned home. Domi is the home part, it's when we get the word domicile, and Reversi is the other part, the to return part, or I returned past tense. In Latin, if a verb ends in I, you can generally recognize it as first person past tense, which you may recognize from the phrase Weni Witty Wiki, which is I came, I saw, I conquered. And with that, I've exhausted what I remember from high school Latin. And I don't really know how deeply I should try to examine what's happening here, because Oda's grasp of English isn't amazing, so I'm not sure how much I should read into his use of Latin. But he could have gone with Domi Reversisti, which would have been you returned home. Granted, it doesn't quite have the same ring to it, and that's probably why Oda went with what he did, but it would make a bit more sense with an attack that targets someone. You, sir, are returning home now. However, what I'm potentially thinking is that because Imu claims to be a god, it is quite fitting to have all of these Latin spells in the first person to make clear who this power is coming from. There's also something in that this could be the first time that Imu has actually been on the surface of the planet in how many centuries? So using the I returned home spell works quite well as a bit of a homecoming for Imu as well. And I also do really like that the more modern English interpretation of the word reversi is visually depicted by having Broggy flipped and reversed into what I imagine could be the abyss, and then having his persona inverted into an evil form, a demonic form, which also becomes insanely larger than a standard giant. Every giant who got Domi reversied in this chapter is now pretty much the same size as Oz or Loki. He's also huge, but without the need for demonic indulgence. Although on that, we could be seeing something so interesting here, because I was about to say that Loki doesn't need any demonic help because he already has the size and his own horns like all ancient giants. But that got my brain thinking, and what we're seeing happening here might be how the ancient giants were originally created in the first place. The idea being that thousands of years ago, a legion of ancient giants were Domi reversied, turning their hearts evil, their heads horny, and their size tres grande. And those demon giants then roamed the world for no other purpose than to cause destruction and spread evil, which is exactly how the tales of Oz are told in the modern day. He was the greatest villain of his era. But these demon giants, they then breed with each other, or actually no, they breed with not each other, and they produce offspring that is, say, only half demon demon. Still pretty bad dudes, but not 100%. And then the next generation after that are only 25% bad dude demons. And we continue along those lines until we reach the modern day, where the demon giant bloodline has become so diluted that they're practically just regular people again. Regular people with some visual leftovers of their heritage and an urge to, every now and then do a bit of the old violence. I'm downplaying that urge, but it could be much worse than that. And that could be what King Harold was grappling with, given that he seems to have known the Holy Knights. If he ever found out that this was his heritage, that the ancient giants come from an unholy spell such as this, then I could see that as a pretty reasonable reason why he would want to rip off his own horns to purge himself of that evil, and also why he would want to rid the ancient giants from Elbaf entirely, because you do have this very literal evil living within your society. But at the same time, that tiny piece of evil is living within completely innocent beings. And as Mr. Dr. Vegapunk proved scientifically, we all have some evil within us, especially you watching this video. You've been very bad. But that evil doesn't always live up to what we've come to expect of evil, and can actually end up being rather good. Just like your incoming decision to check out the Calm Belt, which is a channel currently undertaking the project of re-editing the Grand Line Review video library into themed compilations. Very long videos perfect for your very long form activities like driving, drawing, gaming, sleeping, whatever it is you do for extended periods of time, we've got you covered for as long as it takes, with no need to pause what you're doing and pick a new video every 15 minutes or so. They're not just compilations either, because throughout the years there have been what I refer to as lost videos, and these are Grand Line Review projects that were fully written, recorded, and edited. However, for various different reasons, were never published. I'm not going to tell you where they are, how many there are, or even what they are though, because that's not really in the spirit of One Piece, is it? My videos, well, they're yours if you want them. I left everything I own in the link in the description. So if this new long form channel meets your needs, then please do check it out and make sure to subscribe, because that is insanely important for small channels, and I look forward to seeing you there. But for now, let's get back to you, me. Thanks, me. Anyway, that's all just speculation. But our evil giants they so strongly resemble at least Oz and Oz Jr. They even have the chunky underbite happening as well. Now, there is also a trade-off for this power. Emu states that undergoing this process comes at a cost of lifespan, which Emu describes as quite a small portion of life. However, we should remember that Emu is a being who has lived for almost 1,000 years, so what he considers to be a teeny tiny small piece might equate to a rather large piece from our perspective, or even for a giant who lives somewhere between 300 to 400 years on average, that's not even half as much as Emu, and it could even be significantly less than half. So I don't really know if I trust Emu's measurements here. I mean, it's one Immortality Brocky. What could it cost? 200 years? And that cost is something to bear in mind, because if we do find a way to revert Dory and Broggy, as well as all of the other giants from the state, that doesn't necessarily mean their life force will come back to them. That price has already been paid, and we don't know what the policy on refunds is at the Emu Mart, but my guess is that all transactions are final. And also, there's a bit of confusion about why the cost actually matters, because the giants have been granted these what have been translated as immortal bodies, although this is another case where I'm not necessarily sure that the word immortal and the concept of immortality is a good choice, and I'm very keen to see how the official translation handles this. But from what I understand, the body itself becomes essentially indestructible. Yes, it can be slightly more permanently hurt by certain abilities, but in this chapter we did see Saint Summers regenerating, so whatever Scopogaban used on him is ultimately a glorified delay tactic. We still can't inflict truly permanent damage on people with these bodies, but having those bodies also doesn't necessarily stop the aging process, which is why we saw Garling as but a young banana, whereas now we see him as a very ripe old man. So you would still be making a fairly large sacrifice to attain this power. However, with that said, there must also be an optional add-on for Emu to halt the aging process and to make that cost not so much of a cost. And in fact, that's probably what's happened with Saint Saturn and the rest of the 5 Elder Stars. Saturn paid the life price for bodily goodness, but Emu then froze his aging, and when Emu decided to unfreeze it, that life cost that Saturn paid finally caught up with him, and he shriveled into a pile of bones and dust, as his debts from the Bank of Life finally caught up with him and sent him into Chapter 11 life bankrupt. bankruptcy. And it also gives me a bit of pause for thought for something that I originally thought I really wanted after reading this chapter, which was to see this ability used on one of the Straw Hats to get an evil Straw Hat. Specifically Luffy, I would love to see an evil devil Luffy using a very dark Gear Fifth, although I'm not sure if Oda would ever thematically allow that to happen. Every time there's an opportunity for dark One Piece, Oda likes to remind us that this is a story of hope and optimism, so even if Luffy was subject to this power, he'd probably have the inner strength to maintain himself and just start using wacky cartoon devil powers for the fun of it. But also the life cost also makes it unlikely that any of our Straw Hats are going to succumb to that ability. It is such a high stakes idea that Oda has set up if that cost cannot be refunded, so it really doesn't leave a lot of room for flippant fun conversions. What I do think we could see though is the Devil Giants or even Devil Emu versus Demonio Robin. Because in this chapter, someone, Robin, for the first time asks where all of the useful crew members are. The Luffys, the Zoros, and the Sanjais. Where are they? Because we're now at the point where we officially really need to call the Avengers in on this. It's like wandering into the final boss without realizing that you haven't healed your main party members. So you stumble into the boss and it's like, oh mate, I have absolutely nothing to fight you with. I'm afraid this is no longer a lower or mid crew issue, although I do love how Robin in this chapter decides that, well, they can't afford to just sit and wait for Luffy to show up, and it's implied that she's about to do something potentially drastic because that is what needs to be done. And that thing could be a Demonio, because why not? Demonio Robin looks very aesthetically similar to Devil Gunko, and it might be a fun situation where Emu sees this form and comments on it being a poor imitation. But something that makes me a little bit nervous is that yes, Robin is bound by the powers of Summers, which in this case, I think that's very much the preferred state of being, because Jinbei, Brook, Nami, and Usopp are now all essentially under the control of Emu because they're stuck in Gunko's abilities and Emu is controlling Gunko. But here's one way I could see this panning out. If Emu were to use this position to try and do something against Brook, in that kind of situation, Gunko may be able to be all like, no, and to something power of love her way out of this situation, out of his control, if only briefly. Because in terms of the end game here, I'm not sure what else we can do to solve this problem other than to have Gunko reject Emu's presence and for him to, for whatever complicated magical reasons, not be able to use Killingham or Summers as an alternative avatar. Because there is probably something special about Gunko that allows her to be used, and it may be why the Holy Knight is so polite and respectful towards her despite her lack of sainthood, because she can act as the vestal of Emu, which is of course a great honor. Speaking of Killingham though, his abilities got fleshed out a fair bit in this chapter as well. In addition to discovering our endgame RPG boss, Killingham's nightmare creatures also seem to operate on a spawn point system. Because there are these holes all over Elbaf, right? Holes that are constantly pumping out nightmares, and so nothing can really be killed because allegedly the concept of death doesn't exist in dreams. But the solution here is fairly simple. I think every person who's ever played a game knows that we just need to destroy those spawn points. No holes, no monsters. Although there's also a very curious kind of interaction between the abilities of Killingham and Emu in this chapter, and I didn't even notice this at first because I was so focused on the giants. But if you look at the final spread, it's not just the giants with horns and fangs. All of Killingham's nightmare creatures have now been granted horns and fangs as well. And I wonder if that's because they're being juiced up by Emu, or if it's because the nature of the nightmares of those on Elbaf have changed, with the scariest possible things now being mentally registered as having horns and fangs. So in a way, it's the citizens of Elbaf who are controlling what it is they have to go up against. Their fears are directly manifested, meaning that the creatures could, in theory, also be turned into super cutesy versions of what they are if someone like Luffy was able to install Laughter.exe into the OS of Elbaf. Or another alternative would be if Loki comes in to save the day and starts being viewed as a positive force. In that case, the Nightmare Loki could turn into a good guy and start fighting off his fellow nightmares, stuff like that. And the same thing with Nightmare Nika. If the giants see Luffy in Gear Fifth acting like a goofy whackpot, then Nightmare Nika could be affected, and we could slowly see the army of nightmares turn into an army of dreams. And not just those two either, because to continue our ongoing C plot of Elbaf, yes, that kid's mother is also in this final spread, fully equipped with horns and fangs, and officially looking even more horrifying than Charlotte Linlin. But if the real mother puts on a solid showing of heroism, then this mother could be on our side as well. With the big thundercloud, that could be a job for Zeus because they look so incredibly similar already. However, the rest of the creatures are admittedly a bit more difficult to come up with an equivalent to, but I do think this is a case where being able to conquer the concept of fear is going to be key to salvation. Salvation for most anyway. We do actually have important character death on our Grand Line Review 2025 bingo card, and this chapter may have given us an unfortunate target for that square, as Imu's orders are to kill Yarl, and he gets the very last panel of the chapter, claiming that he will not run away from an invitation to the battle ball. A warrior does not decline a dance with the fair lady of death. And short of the monster trio finishing their picnic and deciding to do something, I'm really not sure what could prevent Yarl from his murder on the dance floor. On the bright side, I do think that this chapter has pretty sufficiently killed the idea that Yarl is a traitor. If he was, then there'd be no reason to go and kill him. So the leaky pipe of suspicion is now ominously dripping traitorous liquid pretty exclusively onto the bald, dead head of King Harold at the moment. So I'm very much looking forward to that flashback. And just on flashbacks, I must say that it is just a little bit annoying that we didn't even come close to addressing the Brook-Gunko connection after being so thoroughly teased in the last chapter, but that's just kind of how One Piece goes sometimes with Oda's leapfrog plot point system. And to be fair, if there was any chapter where we really needed to focus on just one thing, it was this chapter. In most manga, focusing on a single thing per chapter, that sounds pretty standard. One chapter covers one thing in one spot. However, in One Piece, Oda has this really great ability to jump around to several threads within a single chapter and not make it feel too eclectic or jarring, and actually it usually makes 18 pages every week feel far more substantive than a lot of other manga. But every now and then an event comes along where you cannot afford to switch focus, and this is one of those moments. This is the reveal of potentially the final boss of One Piece, and I do like that after finally stepping into the spotlight, after over 1,100 chapters, Imu refuses to relinquish any stage time whatsoever. Even right at the beginning where we spent a couple of pages focusing on the kids and the adults, Imu was like, I'm not having any of that, and just knocked them all out. Imu is very much like, I'm here now, you are focusing on me. Although the really interesting part is that if this is where Imu chooses to make a stand in the series, and I can't imagine that it is, this just doesn't feel like the right time to be dealing with Imu. I'm thinking this is just a little taste of what's to come, but if it is, then we may not necessarily be looking at our final boss, as we do still have a potentially even greater force of darkness just lurking and waiting for his opportunity to claim the world.